I would also like to acknowledge that we're standing on Aboriginal land here tonight, land that was never ceded, land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. So it's really good to be here tonight. Congratulations to the Australian Fabians for putting a great series together that looks at the future of work. I think it's the perfect issue to be talking about at the moment. It's also a bit special for me personally to be here because my grandfather Bob Webb was very active with the Fabian Society too, and so I sort of feel like he's with me tonight, which is nice. So I'm lucky enough to be talking about cooperatives, which is a lovely topic to be talking about. And I wanted to start this evening by sharing with you a realisation that I have had recently. It may seem very obvious to others in the room, but it's kind of only just crystallised in my head after my experience in working on several different cooperative projects. And that is that starting a cooperative is a political act. At least that's the realisation that I've come to. It's a beautiful and hopeful political act. In a world where taking political action is often confronting and antagonistic, and particularly working for a union for the last 6 years, I can attest to that. But it is a political act nonetheless. I thought that we could start by looking at a couple of examples of what I mean by cooperatives, and I'm sure that people in the room will know some of them that I'm going to talk about. How many people here know or have heard about Mondragon? Yeah, great. Probably know more than I do. If we could go to the next. I just pulled a few bits and bobs off their website today as I was preparing for this. Many of you also may have read Race Matthews' work on Mondragon, including the book that he's written, Jobs of Our Own, so I'm sure that there's a wealth of knowledge in this room, and I don't mean to tell people what they already know. Briefly, Mondragon began with cooperatives forming in the Basque countries near Spain in 1951, and it's now grown into a huge federation of cooperatives and businesses with almost 75,000 people working in an economic system that prioritises people and sustainability rather than profits and shareholder returns. It's now the world's biggest worker cooperative, Mondragon. The highest salaries are capped at 8 times what the lowest workers are paid. If one cooperative is struggling for one reason or another, they can borrow from another cooperative until that cooperative becomes again successful and then can lend to another cooperative that might not have had its bills paid by another company, for example. Mondragon withstood the global financial crisis and it continued to support the workers and families while other free market companies shed workers, slashed wages or closed. So the great news is that thanks to Mondragon, no one can say that economic democracy is not possible. It's not only possible, but I would say it's preferable. So cooperatives can offer workers a say over their working life and the running of the business or enterprise that they're actually a part of. Co-ops can cater to community needs in a way that capitalism and global corporations cannot, because they're set up to sustainably support the workers who own them, rather than exploiting workers as much as possible to provide a bigger return for bosses and shareholders. Bringing democratic principles into work and the creation and distribution of wealth empowers people. I think we all know that, and cooperatives offer a creative and collaborative way to do that. I like talking about cooperatives also because it's about talking about economic and environmentally sustainable ways forward in terms of the future of work. I don't think there's been a better time to organise for new ways of doing work. In Australia today, as John touched on, we're seeing inequality growing, and to a large part that's because of the rise of insecure work, wage stagnation, and mounting attacks on a shrinking union movement. there is a concentration of wealth and power. And for those who hold tightly onto that wealth, I wonder perhaps if the emergence of a participatory democratic economy doesn't sound like the best idea. I want to talk now about an experience that I had in the last couple of years. If we could go to the next slide. At the end of 2014, the National Union of Workers saw another worksite close. This time it was Ingham's. It was a poultry facility in McLaren Flat, so the Fleurieu Peninsula in South Australia. Now, just to let you know that this photo is a photo of some of the workers with others who I'll get to shortly that work towards setting up a co-op. So South Australia has seen more than its fair share of closures and job losses in the last few years, and at Ingham's site it would have meant 98 workers were going to lose their jobs just before Christmas in 2014. People were not earning much more than the minimum wage there. So in terms of redundancy payouts, it was very minimal in terms of what they would do once losing their jobs, but also for the casual workers that were there, it was nil. So it wasn't like we were talking about had a lot of capital in between the workers that had just lost their jobs. The idea of a cooperative buyout came from a few conversations really, and it seemed incredibly exciting, but there was a genuine question of whether it could actually happen. So this picture was taken at the McLaren Vale Town Hall. It's not the first meeting. At the first meeting of workers at that town hall, one of the first questions that came from a worker who unfortunately isn't in that photo, he put up his hand and he said, yeah, okay, this all sounds really great, but who's going to be our boss? And it kind of summed up what I think a lot of people in the room were thinking. And it led to a very honest and powerful, about 3-hour meeting. And the result was that workers left that meeting having decided and voted that they really had nothing else to lose. They were also incredibly excited at this new concept. And that they were going to try and start a cooperative and take over the processing facility and run it themselves. So at the next town hall meeting, we also invited the broader McLaren Vale community to come to that. And there was actually a lot of interest. A lot of people came, and we found that our worker-owned cooperative then expanded into a worker-farmer cooperative with several small and medium-sized farmers who were producing ethical poultry. They were doing biodynamic and organic, obviously free range, in the area, and they actually saw this co-op idea as a way to help them change their own industry. And so unions, workers and farmers united, and off we went on our journey, which was great. A lot of work went into figuring out what to do next, and at a subsequent town hall meeting, we come to this one here, the South Australian Minister for Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, Leon Bignell, announced that the state government would grant $75,000 to fund a feasibility study. And so this, at this point we thought we really could do this. The feasibility study itself was much better than any of us could have hoped, actually. It was completed by Dench, McLean, Carlson, which was agreed on with the state government, and it showed that the site could reopen as a cooperative, employing from the get-go 50 full-time workers, and looking at a profit of $1 million after the first 12 months. So we were on to something here. This could work. At that time, we needed an estimated $2 million to get the factory up and running. We had several small-scale local and organic biodynamic producer members that were on board, so we were looking at actually needing the product, and I apologise if there's vegans or vegetarians in this room, but that's the co-op that we were looking at starting up. But we also then, through advertising, through lots of different networks, including social media, we got some bigger scale free-range producers on board. So we really could have gotten things up and running fairly quickly. Local restaurants and wineries were watching. They were coming to meetings. They were very interested. And Simon Bryant, if people remember ABC's Cook and the Chef with Maggie Beer and Simon Bryant, Simon Bryant became our first ambassador, and he was really supportive and spoke publicly about why this kind of a co-op should go ahead. So then we came to the $2 million and we politely asked for a meeting to discuss a grant from the state government. And we didn't hear back. And then we started an online campaign with an open letter to the minister asking for financial support to back this regional co-op, and we didn't hear back. And then we made contact with a cooperative bank. We showed them the results of the feasibility study. We'd also done a business plan. On the back of that, they said, we would loan you the $2 million that you need. As I say, we didn't have any capital. We're talking about minimum wage workers that had just been sacked. So they said, if the government will underwrite a loan, then we'll give it to you because we can see the potential here. And we couldn't get a meeting. So I'll just take a bit of a backward step because for more than 12 months we tried everything we could to get a cooperative going. And it really would have not just been about the 50 workers at the factory to begin with. It was starting to clearly encompass the entire community, from the hospitality trade to the farmers to tourism, and it was becoming a very holistic project. This gentleman next to the man in the high vis with the beard at the back there is Rick Duke, and he is one of the workers from Ingham's, and he was the main driver of this project. And he spent over 12 months trying to get it up with funds coming from different places to fund his wage while he did that because he was out of work. So with the help of farmers, there was Sophie Wakefield and Trevor Peach, the whole Fleurieu community, Tony Webb, Anderson's lawyers, who are our union lawyers in South Australia, the Goulburn Valley Co-op, which is another amazing co-op after the SPC Heinz tomato cannery shut down, and the Business Council of Co-ops and Mutuals, along with the union and many others, were all backing Rick to try and get really over the hump of getting the initial funds. We had a lot of media coverage. Rick was the star on the project one night, and there was support starting to come in from around Australia. We still couldn't get that startup investment capital. Again, we were being thwarted by the fact that wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few in this country, and our whole society suffers for it. So as time slipped by, Ingham's, with no other buyers in sight, we were the only buyers that were talking to them. They started gutting the factory, and what was an initial $2 million proposal to start things up became something more like a $10 million startup. So on the 16th of March 2016, Rick posted his last post on the Fleurieu Poultry Facebook page, and I'm going to take a minute just to read it because actually, the Facebook page is a wonderful resource. You can still go and look at that in terms of the timeline, what happened in those 12 months. But Rick says, "Hi all, and many apologies for the lack of posts lately. However, this post is one I've been putting off for some time now. It is with a heavy heart that we announce we are unable to continue with our project at this stage and highly unlikely to reinvent ourselves in the future. The prime reason for this is that some time ago, despite assurances from Ingham's that the factory would be sold as is, they decided to completely strip the factory of all poultry processing equipment, with much of it being crushed on site. This doubled the finance we would have required at least, and would have added much more to getting up and running. We would also like to have looked at alternative sites, but finding a suitable site proved near impossible. Add to that the government's unwillingness to sit down and talk to the bank that wanted to back us, and it became a hill too steep to climb. So to the knockers, you were right, we didn't make it. Without doubt, though, in our minds, we proved that a poultry processing industry could have been created and become successful. To our many supporters, we say thank you from the bottom of our hearts. There are too many to list, but the main player was always the National Union of Workers, who poured much time and resources into this project. Dr. Tony Webb also deserves a mention for his tireless work, and to this day the NUW remain committed to community cooperatives as a real tool to help stem our current unemployment crisis. Best wishes to all of our supporters. You can imagine not just Rick, but everyone was pretty crushed at that point because we had to stop trying, and Rick needed to get another job to be able to survive. So the story of the Fleurieu Poultry Co-op, I think, raises many questions that I don't have answers to. Why didn't the government meet with us? Why didn't they back the co-op? There's also questions that came out of that period around the funds that we all have in our superannuation funds and why that money is so locked up into thinking more first about shareholder returns and rather than community programs that can create jobs and actually start to transfer some of the wealth that's concentrated in so few hands into something much more sustainable. So we've, as a union, been continuing to think about that whilst we negotiate EBAs with Coles and Woolworths. So I don't have a lot more time, but I wanted to touch very briefly on another cooperative, if we could go to the next slide. And another reason I think why we need to begin collectively organising to demand support for co-ops in Australia. How many people have heard of the Earthworker Cooperative? Cool. Okay, so we're looking at a co-op that's really dealing with the climate crisis, which is real and coming our way. It's already here. And so what does the climate crisis do to the future of work, and what jobs will we have in the future because of that? I think it's really great to see more and more people talking about just transitions. In fact, actually tomorrow the ACTU is running a conference in Canberra. It's called A Fairer, Cleaner Future, Uniting for a Just Transition. So hats off to the peak union body for taking that up. And I think that unions have a obviously very big role to play in the just transition. It's something that Earthwork have been engaging with in a practical way for more than a decade. And they currently have a factory ready to go in Morwell, full of manufacturing equipment to start producing solar hot water units, one of which I actually have on my house because mine blew and I got an Earthworker one. And I've had solar hot water now for a few years with no problems, so I can prove they work. But this is in an area that's just seen the formal announcement of the closure of Hazelwood, which obviously everybody knows about, which was a corporate decision that did not come to many as a surprise. So while Earthworker can't supply all of those mine workers with secure cooperative jobs, it is an example of what the new jobs could look like, being sustainable, democratic and empowering. So what does Earthworker need to get going? They are asking at the moment the state government to procure solar hot water, photovoltaic and battery storage into public housing, which Earthworker can provide. It would give the factory down there a big kickstart as well, because it used to operate out of Dandenong. And their plan was always to go to Morwell. Their plan was always to go to Morwell because of the fact that it was an area where transitions jobs would be needed. There is actually a huge amount of community support for Earthworker in the Latrobe Valley, and there has been for a long time now. Hundreds of local people and Melburnians alike recently walked the entire distance from Melbourne to Morwell, and it happened to fall, they didn't plan it that way, but it happened to fall over the week that Hazelwood closure was announced. But it was a very amazing example of taking collective action and resulted in sore feet for many people, but was very worthwhile. They got a lot of media coverage, and I was on a plane this morning, but Dan Musil, who's the Secretary of Earthworker, was also on ABC Radio National this morning, so some of you might have heard him there. That's one of my favourite quotes from him. This is not a protest, it's a declaration of hope. So I think that sums up what they're trying to do. So just to finish, worker and community-run cooperatives, I think, have a key role more than ever in creating new jobs to build a sustainable Australia. But their very nature in some ways pushes up against the status quo. Unless there is a change in direction and policy, I think we're going to continue to face the problem of accessing startup capital for cooperative models. Meanwhile, those that benefit from the concentration of wealth and power will inevitably continue to make decisions that maintain the current status quo. Which brings me back to my first point and recent realisation that starting a cooperative is a political act. And I think only people can change this, and we can only do it if we organise, says the organiser that works for a union. But I think it's true, and the way that we can organise for cooperative models is by showing solidarity, being creative, and taking more collective action. So thank you.